Hey guys, how's it going? So today I kind of wanted to delve a little bit into what is gender and how ought we to understand what gender is as Catholics, because it's honestly not a very clear field. I think at the most basic, if you asked most Catholics what gender is, they'd say it's synonymous with sex. You know, there's man and woman, there's male and female, there's men and women. It's just sex versus gender, and historically speaking, that isn't an incorrect assessment. However, I don't think it's an entirely useful one, and I'm going to state an unpopular opinion as far as Catholic opinions go, in that I think there is a genuine use in distinguishing sex from gender, because I know that discussion alone gets really convoluted and controversial very quickly. I want to be clear. I don't think they're entirely separated, as in they're not completely distinct. They rely on one another, but I do think they are distinct concepts. I think it's useful to describe the biological condition of humans. And that's what I think is easily referred to as sex. And it is a specific condition relating to humans, specifically in terms of reproduction. It's a biological category. It's something that happens across many animals, including humans, and it's the mode by which humans reproduce. And because of that, all humans fall into either the male or the female categories of sexual reproduction. However, there is an element of our gender that relates to, or of our beings, that relates to the way we interrelate with one another. And that seems closely connected with the biological sex, but does also seem distinct from it, because the way we interrelate isn't purely related to reproduction. So what it kind of comes down to, in my thoughts, is that sex is the direct biological condition of every person, whereas gender I would define as a mode of relationship informed by biological sex. What I mean by that is, for example, there's the age-old question: can men and women just be friends? Can a man have a friend who's a woman and she's just a friend? It remains totally platonic. And that question in particular is a question for another video, but it identifies a fact that the difference in biological sexes is important to the way that men and women interrelate, even on a level of simple friendship. A buddy of mine and I were having this debate once, and he kept saying there's something inherently sexual about a relationship between men and women, because even if they're not engaged in romance, their sex plays a role in determining how they interact with one another. So he said because their sex plays a role in determining that, they have a sexual relationship. To which I fired back with, well, then don't we have a sexual relationship, us two men? Because us both being male is informing how we're interrelating with one another. That right there, that connection is what I would call our gender, because it's clear that we're not in some kind of sexual relationship. We're just close friends, even as men. But our being male is informing the way in which we're relating to one another. I think drawing this distinction between gender and sex actually starts drawing out some really interesting details. There are, as people have pointed out for years, as gender theorists have pointed out for years, decades even, there is differences in gender and gender roles between different cultures. And so this has led a lot of people to decide or deduce or reason that gender is some kind of social construct. And I don't want to deny that. There's definitely a very clear social aspect to gender, but more particularly to our relationships and the way that one person interacts with another or multiple other people based off of what society expects from them, based off of their biological sex. That's why I think it's important to think of gender distinctly from biological sex as that mode of relationship, the way that you relate to another person. But I also think it's really important to identify there's things about gender that don't change. There are things about the way that men and women interacting with one another don't change from one culture to another. One example of this would be the marital act, which I think is fair to describe as a relationship because it's two people interacting with one another in a very particular way. And so their biological sex is involved in it, and their gender is really importantly involved in it as well, because there's two different modes going on there, one for the male and one for the female, and it's very different experiences for both persons. And that's where the Catholic Church would very rightly identify that there is a complementarity between the sexes and between the genders in that moment. The way that the man interacts with the woman and the woman with the man complement one another. But if we broaden the scope a little bit and say, well, not just the marital act, how can gender vary and how can it not vary? I think as we move out from there, because that's really the crux of it right there. That is the pinpoint key, biggest, most important thing that most of gender and sex both revolve around, is the marital act. So as we're going to get farther away from that, the rigidity is going to dissolve a little bit. It's going to go down and down and down until it seems totally arbitrary. This is what I'm calling the accidental properties of gender. So I've identified different things that I would call the accidental qualities versus the substantial qualities. The accidental qualities being those things that can change, that they're not very set in stone, especially culture to culture or even subculture to subculture. It might be one way, but in another it might be another way. Clothing is a really big thing that I'll get into later about how clothing itself is gendered according to this definition. But it is, and it's kind of arbitrary, and it's totally accidental. It can change without changing what gender really is. And then on the other half of things, the essential qualities of gender, those are the things that can't change. Like I was saying, in the marital act, in that relationship, you can't really change the experience that the male has versus the female. They're very set in stone. It doesn't matter where you go or when. It's the same thing. And so that's what I'm calling more the substantial qualities, the things that can't change. In a broader sense, taking a step out from the marital act, back to that discussion of friendships. Gender is really important in our friendships in ways that can't really change. A lot of people have pointed out that there seems to be some element of sexuality and I would say genderedness between male and female friends. And this comes from the point that men and women are biologically inclined to the marital act. And so a man interacting with a woman is going to interact with her differently because she's a potential partner than a man is going to interact with another man because he's not a biological partner in the sense of reproduction. So that distinction between those two modes of interacting with one another becomes the substantial quality. It doesn't matter where you go or when you go, that's going to be the same kind of a biological fact. The difference in biological sex and evolution kind of pushes us to identifying potential partners. So that's another substantial quality of sex, because it's unchanging. Whereas if we go back to clothing and think about that a little bit, how we dress is very different than how people used to dress, or how people in another country dress. And yes, clothing is gendered insofar as clothing is kind of a communication. We interrelate with one another by how we dress, by kind of what we're saying with what we dress. You know, it comes down a lot to modesty. It's very similar to modesty. You know, there's things that we should and shouldn't wear because of what it says about ourselves and how it conveys the self to another. And our biological sex is part of what we convey in that. So our clothing is gendered, but it's gendered in a very accidental way. It can change and shift from culture to culture. And so the way we interact with it is distinct from the way that we interact with the substantial qualities of gender. I feel like this has been really rambly. I'll have to piece it together somehow for y'all. But I think kind of some of my key points come down to identifying that there seems to be a difference between sex and gender, where I am calling sex the strict biological form of humans, and gender being a mode of relationship that's informed by our biological sex. And then on top of that, gender can be broken down into its accidentals and its substantial qualities. The substantial qualities being modes of relationship that can't be changed, and the substantial or the accidental qualities being modes of relationship that do change and often change. I've been really rambling in this video, and I think I've probably gotten to time. So I'm going to have to leave this on a little bit of a cliffhanger going into, because there's a lot more to get into, especially in that distinction between substantial and accidental qualities of gender. So if you are really interested in hearing about those, please comment. Tell me what you think about these distinctions, these definitions that I'm using of sex and gender. Maybe point out some things that you think might be identified as a substantial quality or an accidental quality. If you disagree, if you've got an objection to what I have to say, especially put that down there. I will address that in future videos, because my goal is to kind of root out this tangled web of what the heck is going on here. So if you can, comment down below with your thoughts and comments. Comment with your comments. If you're interested to hear more, you can subscribe, and then you'll be notified in the future when I upload later videos getting into more of the details between these distinctions. And yeah, I think that's it. Definitely let me know what you think. Hit the subscribe button. Tell me your thoughts so that I can make future videos on your thoughts, addressing problems, because that's one of the brilliant things about philosophy, is that without other people addressing or pointing out problems, it goes nowhere. So I feel like my ideas are really good and well thought out, but you're probably going to be like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, but tell me why I don't know. Especially rambling aside, I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much. Toodles.